Okay, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Today's program is as much about universities and colleges as it is about students and their career planning. When we talk about career planning, we are talking about a number of stakeholders, and I hope to involve all the stakeholders in today's discussion. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson was a and the assistant told him that he would be leaving the administration and he would be accepting the fellowship in a university. The president was quite taken aback and he asked, which university? He was told it was Wesleyan University. And the person asking for the leave was Mr. Richard Goodwin. And he said to the president that he would prefer an academic career at Wesleyan University to any job in the administration. Mr. Goodwin, of course, so Mr. Goodwin, of course, was a fellow at Wesleyan, and he was also the husband of Kearns Goodwin, who is one of the greatest historians in America right now. So, to discuss Wesleyan University and careers and career planning and career decision making, I have a very accomplished person from the academia, Dr. Castonguay. Welcome to the program, Doctor.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, let's tell us a little bit about your university, and then we will proceed to career plan.
So Wesleyan University is what we call a small liberal arts college, meaning we have about 3,000 undergraduates, so much smaller than larger universities you might be more familiar with. A liberal arts curriculum means that we're encouraging students to take courses all across different disciplines. While they do major in one or two subjects, we encourage students to be taking classes in widely disparate things with the idea that learning across disciplines will make them more flexible, more broadly educated, and better able to handle the ambiguity and the churn, of the modern job market and just the kind of problems that we face globally now.
So what is a career center? Because you are the director of the Gordon Career Center. What is a career center and what does it do exactly?
So, career centers work with students throughout their time in college to be thinking about what am I really learning? So, not just what am I getting out of this particular class or, distinct skill sets in this or this, but really thinking holistically about what are all the things that I'm learning, not just inside the classroom, but outside the classroom, maybe through extracurricular activities or volunteer work or activism or internships, and then help bringing together all of that learning to help them also consider what are the things that I'm really interested in? What are the problems that I want to solve? What do I want to learn next after I graduate? And to help them then think long term about how all of the things that they're doing now might translate into different careers down the road. So we start working with students very early on, even to help them find a job on campus, and also to be thinking about what are all of the classes they might be taking or other things they might be getting involved with to help explore their interests and further develop their skill sets.
how important is it for universities and colleges, not just a liberal arts college, but any college, to have a proper career center for its students? And when exactly should career planning start in today's, such a fluid, employment landscape?
So I think what can be hard to wrap your head around is that it's important to start really early in terms of thinking about these questions, but without setting really concrete goals necessarily. Because one of the things I'm fond of saying is that if someone like me, who has spent decades working in career development, doesn't know what the jobs are going to be when our students graduate, then nobody else does either. It's just we're dealing with a point in history where there's a shifting landscape even among professional jobs. So students need to be able to constantly be thinking about what is happening now and what am I learning and how can I be adding value on the job market without necessarily thinking in terms of a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. So because of all this ambiguity in the market and because it is a very different way of thinking than your parents may have had, it's vital for universities to have career centers to help students with this thinking and this decision making.
Is it fair to say that career planning is a young field because in the past careers were basically cut out for people?
I think it depends on the part of the world that you're in. In the US, this field is about 100 years old, give or take. It really started with the Industrial Revolution when you had a lot of people moving from farms to cities and needing to figure out how are they going to fit into what was then, a new world of work with the Industrial Revolution. And there was also a lot of focus on this type of activity during the World War I, World War II, when the government was trying to figure out how to take new soldiers and put them into different roles in, the army or the navy or whatever, so that by the time you got to the, post World War II era, having career centers at universities was a fairly normal thing. I do see, talking with colleagues in other parts of the world, that it is not as developed, and that it's something that's a newer idea and newer things that are getting put into place. But I'm seeing just in recent years a lot of traction and a lot of activity in that area as well.
All right, I apologize for the delay because we have some technical issues here. All right, thank you very much for that. And there's a lot of focus on students, on applicants making good resumes and writing good applications. But there's another side to that also. The human resource manager must be able to read the resume properly also in order to bring about a good synthesis or a good match between the job and the applicant. So my question is about this other side. What do good human resource managers look for when they are reading a resume, and how should a resume be read so that the strengths of the person you're hiring can be gleaned?
Well, I think that there's two ways of answering this. One, I think it's important to know that particularly with larger organizations, if you're looking at a multinational organization, they might not have an HR manager reading the resume at all. It may well be a computer. They're using AI to be sifting through a lot of resumes. And in those cases, what's really important is to be thinking about, is your resume formatted in such a way and does it include the keywords from the job descriptions so that the program that's reading the resume is recognizing you as someone who's qualified for the role. This makes it very, very difficult for entry level candidates, however. And I think that when you start talking about HR managers that are either looking at the shorter list of resumes that the computer may have chosen, or if it's a smaller organization where they are genuinely going through a stack of resumes, what's important for them is to be able to see, have you developed relevant skill sets across whatever combination of your coursework and things you're doing outside the classroom. Maybe you lead a student group, for instance, or maybe you're heavily involved in some kind of volunteer work, where they can connect the dots and kind of see what that narrative is throughout that document, to see how you might be interested in that position that you've applied to and have the relevant skill sets for it. And that can be tough to do in something that's relatively static, like a resume. And this is why it's important for students to have at the ready, what that narrative is. How are they connecting the dots of how their interests and their skill sets developed for this? And then look for ways throughout the application process to be getting that across to the hiring manager, particularly during an interview.
Sorry, my next question will be about the thing that you said about connecting the dots. A lot of students come and they say, I did this activity, I did that activity, I was the president of that, I was the president of this. This is one side of the spectrum. On the other side, there are students who say, I did this subject because I did not want to do that subject. I mean, that is their only justification for doing a certain subject. So when you do so many activities, how do you present those activities to the person hiring you? And how do you justify doing so many activities? And how do you present the fact that those activities have actually added value to you?
Yeah, this is why you need to figure out what your own personal narrative is, because it's not going to be the same for any two people. It needs to be something that's really distinct to you and your experience. And I think what you don't want to do is talk about sort of the negative side. So, in other words, I did this because I didn't want to do that. That never sells very well. That it's really more about, I was interested in this for this reason, and this is what I learned from that experience. And then to think about maybe not talking about every single thing you did, particularly if it was something that you didn't really enjoy or was less successful, but thinking about, what is that through line? What is that common thing that might run through other elements of your background, so that you can bring it together into one coherent narrative. And you might at different points choose different pieces of those skill sets. So I'll give a specific example. When I was in secondary school, I was a tour guide in historic homes in my hometown. And at the time, I saw that as important because I was very interested in studying the history of art in college. So when I was going on my interviews to get into college, I was talking about that experience in the context of my interest in art history. Later on, what I discovered, and I did not end up pursuing that field. However, I have in my professional life done an enormous amount of public speaking, and I'm often asked about how I developed those skill sets and that interest in doing that type of work. And it actually goes back to when I was a tour guide. I was talking to over 100 people a day just in the course of my job by the time I was 16, and developed that skill set. So at any different point, you might have different arguments for how and why you developed a skill set and how and why it's relevant to that new thing. But it's not, for me, it's never about, well, like, oh, I decided not to go into art history because. It's about, this is what I got out of this amazing experience, even if I didn't choose to pursue that as a career.
And I think that's a very important thing that you pointed out. The personal narrative. The narrative is very important whenever you are writing an application, whenever you are selling yourself. The person you are must come across. The skill sets that you bring must come across. And a very important thing, the values that you are espousing, or the values that you acquired through some work that you did, whatever. those should come across properly. So yes, thank you very much for this question. Next, I was reading somewhere that education in the United States has become 565% more expensive than it was in 1986. So that puts a lot of challenge for the parents, whether they are in Pakistan or in the United States. They have to plan. So when should parents start planning for the finance of the college education?
My daughter is starting secondary school this year. We started saving for college as soon as she was born. That is just the practical reality of how expensive higher education is in the US. Um, yeah, it's something that requires an enormous amount of financial planning and something that has to start very, very early. And there's not a lot of ways around that.
Because a lot of students that who come, they say, I want a full scholarship. I want a full scholarship. How can each and everyone get a full scholarship? And there are limits and constraints on universities as well. So that whenever you have a child, just start planning for their educational finances. Uh, a lot of people define success in terms of achievement. What is your perspective on success, and how should it be measured?
No, this is something I've been giving a lot of thought to recently because I'm developing a new course that I'm teaching next semester called Success and Failure here at Wesleyan, specifically for first year students. And the reason I wanted to develop that class is because I do feel like there is an enormous amount of pressure on college students now to be successful because they're seeing so much economic upheaval in the world, and their parents are very nervous because they're looking at how much money they're spending on their child's education. They want to know they have a return on that investment, but parents are also often seeing an enormous amount of upheaval and instability in their own professions, even if they're in a lucrative profession. Even if they themselves are doing something that has historically been prestigious and well paying, they're seeing a lot of changes, a lot of structural changes even in historically prestigious and high paying roles. And they're very worried about what their children could do to find some stability, find some peace, relative peace in the job market. And a lot of my messaging when I'm talking to these groups is that stability no longer exists. And that's just the reality of the situation. Even in the world's wealthiest economies, there is no safe haven from economic instability. So that what it becomes is about learning the skill sets you need to be not just employed, but employable. Because we know that people graduating from college now are going to have many different jobs and many different careers. So that does, by definition, shift the definition of success, because where in generations before, success might mean that you've chosen a specific lucrative profession, you've gotten good training in that, you've gotten good jobs in that, and you've managed to maintain that role and have a certain professional reputation, and it's been very stable. And that stability and success often went hand in hand. And when those things have now been decoupled, where if there is no stability, then success really means, well, first, it has to be a very personal definition of what does success mean to you? How will you know if you have reached a certain level of success in your career life, in your personal life, and how those things marry together? And then thinking about how can I maintain that professional success when there is no more stability? What are the things, what are the new tricks and techniques? Things like making sure that you're always developing professional relationships, thinking about your broader professional reputation outside of your current organization. There's a lot of things that people have to think about very differently now than they used to. And ultimately, that can be somewhat freeing for individuals because they can shed what might be definitions of success that never really fit them well in the first place. But it can also be really scary because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's much trickier to navigate.
Various chapters, almost in all chapters, it says Haza Fawzan Azim. It means this is the great success. Now, likewise, there is something called the Protestant ethic. In the Protestant ethic, also there is a definition of success. Also, when we talk about capitalism, sociologists often link it to Calvinism. So, to what extent is it correct to say that the definition of success is rooted in religion on the one hand and culture on the other?
I mean,
And
certainly very much.
speaking of stability, I will say that we are right now in a crisis because the internet is quite unstable. But please, just let's ignore that because it will be recorded. Don't worry about
Yeah, and I think that there are absolutely culturally specific definitions of success, 100%. And a lot of what I'm doing working with students in a very diverse university, we have students from all over the world. We have students from all over the US, some of whom have parents who have come from different countries. It's, not everybody is as affected by the Protestant ethic, in other words, directly, but you refer to the Protestant ethic and capitalism. These are things that even if you don't personally affiliate with it, American culture is drenched in this to an extent that most people don't even think about anymore. And the idea behind it is that you're finding God's grace through financial success, that those things go hand in hand. And I don't think most people consciously think of it that way anymore. But when you go back to sort of what are the roots of the particular American brand of capitalism and how people view professional success within it, it really comes down to that people who make more money are seen as better in some ways. And it is really a kind of a sticky idea, and it can be one that's very hard to shed. But that's something else that we try to do at the college level, is help students really think very reflectively on this and make them aware of these influences, of all the cultural influences that might be affecting their decision making. So the class I teach on Coursera, Career Decisions from Insight to Impact, people all over the world take that course. And I think part of the reason for that is what I'm trying to encourage in that class is to have students think reflectively about what are all of these different cultural constructs that are affecting their decision making. Because regardless of where you grew up, where your parents grew up, where your family is now, how much migration there's been within your family, those cultural constructs and their influence on you is going to be as unique as a fingerprint. It's going to be really specific to how you're internalizing all of these different influences and motivations. So the important thing is just to recognize what they are and unpack that for yourself and understand them. And in some cases, you might embrace some of those influences. My parents feel strongly that I do this, and I've thought really reflectively upon that, and I've thought about why they feel that way, and I've decided I agree, and I'm going to go along with that. There's a lot of different ways that these influences can manifest in decision making, but I think what's most important is that recognition of where those influences are coming from.
I was actually having a discussion with Professor Ibrahim Afsa. He also teaches on Coursera. So, and there was one thing he said in the end. He said that I realized a bit late in life that you cannot beat the rules. So at some point you have to sort of compromise with them. I'm going to talk about one rule which I have found very difficult to compromise with. And maybe you can answer that question for me. And that is, it is now being taught in told about in entrepreneurship classes here, and the rule is that your network is your net worth. Now, it goes against my fiber because I believe I'm an absolute meritocrat. I believe in meritocracy. So if your network is fine, but in such a world where your net worth, and to use that old speech, not the content of your character or your content of your skill set, but your network becomes your net worth, what happens to those who do not have that network and who are not very good at reaching out? How do they resolve the problem?
So I think that's a really important question, and I think it's one that there's a lot of confusion around. So thank you for asking that. I think when people hear that your network is really important, they can assume that what that means is that it's important to have a lot of family connections, and that it's important to, be able to call upon someone to grant them favors, and that goes against the idea of a meritocracy. And I don't think that's really what it's about anymore. What we're really talking about when we say that having strong professional relationships is important is just that. So if we go back to this idea that I was referring to earlier, that you're not going to graduate from college and join an organization and stay there forever, and work your way up a career ladder, as they used to call it, right? But that you're going to need to be really flexible and understand that there's no stability, and that you're going to need to be moving around quite a bit, whether within your organization, outside your organization, moving to different countries potentially. What that means, that the only way to do that effectively is that if you have started developing very consciously a professional network over the course of your career that goes hand in hand with your ability to prove yourself as a worker. So it's not either or, it's both. Because nobody in your professional network is going to want to speak for you if they don't know for a fact that you are outstanding at what you do. Because that then can harm their professional reputation, because now they might have put forward your resume, let's say, to human resources. And if you ended up getting hired and didn't do a good job, that would reflect poorly on them. So it's not that the meritocracy is not a part of this. Merit is actually a crucial part of this. But part of having merit now, part of that meritocracy is the ability, is the skill set to very early in your career begin developing these relationships and understanding that it goes both ways. It's not about you meeting people and getting to know people purely so that they can help you, but also so you can help them. You need to understand that anyone who's in your professional circle might be calling upon you to say, hey, I just lost my job. And this is the kind of work I'm looking for. Do you happen to know anyone who might be hiring? Or I'm really interested in this organization. Do you know anyone working in any capacity there who might be able to give me more info about their hiring needs? So this is something that if everybody's doing it, and everybody is really conscious about developing the professional relationships, it's not about your family contacts and calling in favors. It's just about a new way of working, and it's about a new way of managing your career and a specific skill set that needs to be developed. And that is hard when you first graduate, because everybody is kind of starting out at the beginning. But even starting to think about your immediate peers or people who may have graduated a year or two ahead of you, those are all now your early professional circle. And then maybe you do, say, an internship or some kind of summer work, you keep in touch with that boss, and you start just slowly and methodically and consciously developing that broader network of people.
And that is absolute, because wisdom has to be contextualized in the times in which it is living as well. If we take the example of let's say the old Hollywood producers, Vivian Lee, for example, when she was cast for her role, it was the producer who went place to place looking for the right face and the right talent. That was the skill requirement of the producer at that time. Today, the skill requirement is in the worker. Apart from developing the working skills, he also has to develop his own networking and marketing skills. And I put this question to you particularly because in your course you have given a very good example of a person who's just graduated and he goes and he simply networks with people without asking for any favor or any job. And I think that is one exercise that students must do. So that is really nice. How important are fora like LinkedIn and Indeed, and how can they be harnessed for job search?
So LinkedIn has really become the new resume. I am a hiring manager, right? I have openings here at Wesleyan where I might be working on search committees. I might be hiring people from my office. And, part of what and it's actually even higher stakes if you're applying for a job, is say in my office. So I hire people who do career advising, right? So if I'm getting an application in from someone who wants to work for me, I'm reading through the resumes and cover letters they've submitted, but then I'm also saying, well, it's also really important to understand LinkedIn. So I'm going to go look at their LinkedIn profile. And obviously, and I'm going to hold a pretty high bar because that's what we do for a living. But it's safe to extrapolate that even people who don't do what I do and are actively engaged with this for a living, often people are using LinkedIn as a place to not only find candidates, and it is common now for human resources manager to be mining LinkedIn for potential candidates and not waiting for a bunch of resumes to come in, but also to see it as a supplement. So they have a resume and a cover letter, and they're trying to decide if they're interested in going forward to an interview. They're likely to look up that person on LinkedIn to say, well, does what's on LinkedIn match what I'm seeing with a resume and cover letter? Does it flesh out anything that I might be interested in? Do I have a sense of just sort of how they're involved? And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be really, really active on the site in terms of constantly posting or things like that. But it does need to be a fully fleshed out profile. And there's also some really interesting material out there now in terms of helping people use a combination of different AI platforms, like ChatGPT or Copilot or things along Bard or things along those lines. In other words, to help students mine information from LinkedIn, but then also think about how can I put together a good outreach piece? How can I think about who are the people that I should be reaching out to and how can I find them effectively? And there's a lot of really interesting things you can do on LinkedIn now, but I think the most basic thing you need to have is just a fully fleshed out page that really represents you well.
Uh, so a workplace is basically a social organization at the end of the day. And in any social organization, you've got to have your identity cut out. You've got to have your own personal identity, your own self view of yourself, and an identity for others. So we have always called that career identity. So how important is this career identity in a world or in a career landscape which has become dynamic to the point of becoming absolutely fluid?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think, historically, when people think about career identity, or what the great organizational behavior researcher Herminia Ibarra refers to as a working identity, the history was, you're going to pick this one thing. You're going to graduate from college, you're going to go to medical school, you're going to be a doctor, and that is your professional identity. And now working identities are iterative. You're going to graduate from college with a degree in something and you make go work in that thing for a while, but then you're going to develop a new skill set that you weren't anticipating. You're going to get exposed to other things your organization does. Maybe you take a job in another business unit that gets you interested in something else entirely, and that sends you to graduate school in a completely different subject than what you studied as an undergrad. And then that gives you new recruiting opportunities to maybe take on a completely different type of career. So, people are moving and iterating in a lot of different ways so that ultimately your career identity might only make sense in retrospect. If you go, I did this for a podcast a few years ago where, you interview really successful people. Often their careers only make sense in reverse, in terms of trying to see like what is that through line that got them from point A to point B to point C, because you would never be able to anticipate from the beginning how you might have made those changes. So I think being open to that flexibility and that understanding that that career identity, that working identity is going to be constantly in flux, while also understanding that the longer you're out and the more you're getting strong interests in particular fields, the more it's going to be important to be cultivating a professional reputation, meaning an identity that others recognize and can see and appreciate and speak to, which goes to that piece of developing your professional network as well. And that's a big part of career management now, is thinking about, what am I seeing as my career identity? What do I want it to be? How can I be iterating to always be course correcting where I am and where I want to be, while also making sure that others are recognizing where I am now and where I want to be, and that I'm prepared to make those changes.
So I don't know about you, but we who were born in the late 1970s and then the 1980s, and then the 1990s, and then 1999, and so we have been perpetually course adjusting, course correcting, course adapting, course. So, in a nutshell, how has your experience been taking the changes that have come since 1995? Because I remember when I was in college, when I went to college, my first class was the computer science class, and we went to the computer lab, and there was this piece of cloth, and the teacher picked the piece of cloth and he said, "Hey, this thing is called a mouse." And everyone is looking at it, and this is a mouse. And since that time, we've come a long way. So, what problems did you have in course adjustment, and how did you manage it?
It's funny you bring this up, because I was having a conversation yesterday with someone in our IT department about how we're thinking about programming for students around AI, and what we're hearing from employers about students needing to be ready for AI. And I was saying how, when I first learned to do computer programming, it was sitting at a terminal with a mainframe in the background in a cold room, really old school stuff, back in the day. And one of my first professional jobs, there was this brand new thing called the internet, right? And I didn't know anything more about the internet than anybody else because it was brand new. But I was the youngest person in the office, which meant that I, by default, ended up being the one that had to teach everybody the internet. And I had to work with our webmaster to develop the very first website for our office. And I had to work with all of the vendors that were trying to sell us web-based products when people barely knew what the web was. But I think by being of an age where everyone assumed that I would just pick this up more easily, I did. I had to jump in with both feet, and I had to pick it up and I'm now not afraid to pick up new program. If someone throws a new vendor at me or say, "Hey, we need you to learn this," that's no big deal, because those are things I had to do when I was fairly young. I think now, with people that are just entering the workforce, there's actually a very, very big similar opportunity with all of these new platforms, where everyone, most people our age, in other words, are looking at things like ChatGPT and are like, "Oh my God, I got to figure this new big thing now that's going to change the world. And now I have to learn all this all over again." And everyone, it's sort of getting forced down, I think, in a lot of organizations, to the youngest people in the office. Like, okay, well, you're the digital native, you have to figure this out. Well, they're really no more in tune with this than anybody else, because it's all brand new. They're just maybe a little less scared to really dive in. But what I would encourage people to do is dive in, learn all of these new things as much as possible, really dig in to how these new things, these new tools are changing the professions that you're interested in. So for instance, law, I was a paralegal after college. A lot of the things I did as a paralegal are now being done by AI. And in a lot of ways, that's great. Some of the things I did were super boring that nobody would want to do, right? And it's just as well that they're being done by other tools. At the same time, you have to know how to use those tools. And having people in the office who have taken the time to fully understand both kind of on the ground, how can my work be more efficient using some of these things, but also at the 10,000 feet level, now is my job in trouble? How can I be course correcting for that? What are the things that I could be doing within my profession that are not going to go away? And how can I be really adding value during this transition period? I think that's the way people need to be thinking.
And it was when we talk about that journey, the internet, when it came, when President Clinton became president, there were 30 sites on the World Wide Web. So I often say that, look, this is a story that when Moses saw a big creature, God said to him, "Don't worry, this is just a big snake. You hold it; it will become a mast. It will become a stick. Don't worry about it." And then he held it. It became a mast. And after that, when the magicians threw all those snakes at him, he didn't worry, because he said, I've seen that basic python and that basic snake. So I'm not scared of these small snakes. And I think those small snakes today are those software that, or those apps that keep appearing on a daily basis. And we just have to deal with them, because somehow we dealt with the advent of the internet at that point in time. So let's go to the next question, which is what experiences, what activities, what skills we have spoken about, but what kind of experiences should students garner to be ready for the job market? If you can, just speak in a nutshell.
I mean, if you look at surveys that get done of the CEOs of the largest companies, hiring managers at big global organizations, and what are you really looking for in candidates? What it often comes down to is what we historically think of as soft skills, though that's really a terrible term. But the idea is that it's not necessarily very technical skills, because in the eyes of a lot of employers, it's much easier to teach a technical skill, coding in Python or something, right, than it is to teach things like leadership or communication skills. Can you effectively communicate complicated ideas to a layperson? Can you effectively communicate your opinions to your coworkers? Can you effectively communicate in a lot of different media? Can you collaborate with others? And I think those two things go hand in hand. Like, are you not only communicating well, but can you work well with either your immediate teammates or with your customers or with your clients, with your students, depending on what industry you're working in, your patients, right? Whoever it is, you need to be able to collaborate with others for effective results, particularly in a world where everyone is hyper specialized. You need to be able to collaborate with other specialists to actually get things done. So collaboration, communication, digital literacy is also incredibly important. And I think a lot of people confuse that with, I have to major in computer science, if I want stability in the job market. That's not at all the case. But you do need to have a certain amount of facility with doing all kinds of things that might be adjacent to computer science. So do you need to go heavy into theory of computer science? Do you need to literally know how to code? No. But if somebody says, like, we need you to learn this new software platform that we've just adopted, and you need to learn it really quickly because we need to have everybody on board, or you're switching jobs and you discover that that platform that your office ran on in one job is completely different from the one you have to do in a new job. I'm in an office environment now where our university has just moved to a completely new system to do all of its financial and human resources management. So we've all had to learn, on a dime, how to do all of our processes completely differently. And for some, that is very, very difficult. And for others, it's not so difficult because if you're not fearing that process and you've worked in a lot of different organizations where you've had to onboard with a lot of different platforms, or for instance, if I'm looking at new vendors for my office, these are all tech vendors, that I might be able to then pass on to students for different things. I need to be able to get into the weeds with that vendor to understand what they're offering, how they operate, how they make their money. And then if we're looking at things like, well, then the world changes again. Like, we had to learn the internet, we have to learn Chat GPT and all of its cousins, right? Being able to have no fear and jump in and just say, okay, I'm going to take some time. I'll do some online training. I'm willing to get my hands dirty learning this. Digital literacy is incredibly important. I think another one, I could talk all day on this, but I want to add one more before we move on. And that's really like a socio-cultural literacy. So in other words, being able to work with people who are completely different from you, people who have different cultural backgrounds, nationalities, religious backgrounds, who might be different educations, because you have to recognize that in today's work environment, you're going to be working with people who are very, very different from yourself, and learning how to navigate those relationships is incredibly important.
Yeah, and like as I'm going, that's going to be my next question. But as far as I'm concerned, leadership is concerned with three things. It's about number one, having an obsessive interest in what is important to others. The second thing is thinking about the future of our children, and the third thing is leaving the world a better place than we've found it. The world here does not mean the whole world. It means it's my home or my organization or wherever I am. So, what is leadership to you? 30 seconds for that because I still have questions.
Yeah, I don't think my definition is too different. I think leadership is about really understanding the context that you're in, the goals that you're trying to reach, but then also understanding the motivations and influences of the people you are leading. Because if those things don't triangulate, understanding what is motivating those that need to help you get to a goal, and then understanding what are all the things you need to do to get there. If you don't have both of those things and with a complete understanding of that context, you're not going to be very effective.
Thank you. And what is the difference between a midlife crisis and a quarter life crisis? And why are so many people facing the quarter life crisis these days? Another 30 seconds for this.
So this actually goes to my dissertation research. So 30 seconds, I'll try. It What it really comes down to is how much churn and ambiguity there is now in the job market. So I think what used to happen is you would have people who would, you graduate from college, you choose the career, you stay with that career, and then you wake up at midlife and realize that you made the wrong decision and you're kind of bored and unhappy. And you've been on a path of least resistance for a lot of your career and have never quite gotten off of it. Now that young people know, they're graduating from college often realizing that they're going to have to course correct many, many, many times, and realizing how difficult that's going to be. The quarter life crisis then comes down to that realization of, I need to be developing a really specific set of skill sets to be able to understand and take my temperature, be really self-reflective about what do I want out of life, how can I get it without a clear rule book that might have existed before, while also not getting on accidentally a path of least resistance, where I'm still going to end up at midlife unhappy as well. Because we do still see that if people don't take the time to do that work of asking those questions.
And so does having a career script help in avoiding these two crises? And if it does, then how do we justify having one in a very dynamic environment? We're back to that problem.
I think it depends on your definition of script. For me, when I use that term career script, what I'm referring to is something that is really unique to the individual, that your career script is a combination of all of those influences and motivations, which are often cultural, but then are also personal. So, in other words, it's that triangulation, is that combination of my personality traits and my past experiences and just what I think about myself, my own personal identity, combined with all of those external influences. And that could be national, it could be your parents, it could be various subcultural influences, your peers, the institutions you've attended, and how all of those things are coming together so that you are now having this own very personal career script that you are following consciously or unconsciously. And what I'm often trying to get people to do is shift from the unconscious to the conscious. Like, if you understand how all of that is coming together for you, that will help you navigate. This is as opposed to a definition of a career script, which is I am going to study these things in college so that I can go to law school, so that I can be an attorney, and I'm never going to get off that track. And this is what I'm going to do forever. That's the kind of thing that can be a bit poisonous now because it's becoming less and less likely that people are going to be able to follow that very narrow track.
One thing that happens, I'm sure you must have experienced it also, when we talk about students, we talk to students, we try to find out what they are interested in. A lot of them say, uh, any career in which I can make money. And to me, that is very sad. So Jacob Needleman wrote this book, which I read when I was in college. It was called Money and the Meaning of Life. And in that he says, money can buy everything. The only thing it cannot buy is meaning. So if one's career gives meaning to one's professional life, where does money stand in the entire arena of career planning?
Well, I think one thing to recognize is that these things aren't mutually exclusive. I think that a lot of undergraduates, when they start thinking about this, they feel like they have to make a decision of, do I focus on making money or do I focus on something that is going to provide meaning and purpose for my life? And that those two things are mutually exclusive, that there is no overlap between them. And I have not found that to be the case, that there are ways of making money and having a certain level of financial success while still finding meaning and purpose in one's work. And that the magic is in finding the where those two things come together. And that might be different at different points in your life. So, we were talking earlier about how expensive education is in the US. It's very common for students that go to the most expensive schools in our country to then go into the highest paying areas, in part because they might have loans they need to pay off, or they might just feel, well, if my parents actually spent all that hundreds of thousands of dollars, then I owe it to them to be going into something that will help kind of pay that back, in a sense, if not literally, then figuratively. But I also find that if people are genuinely unhappy doing something that's lucrative, they're not going to do it for very long. They're going to figure out, what are the things that make me happy or unhappy about this work, and how can I course correct so that I can find meaning and purpose while still making enough money that I can afford to have the life that I want to live. So I want to be able to raise a family. I want to be able to afford a house. I want to be able to send my own kids to school. So it's not about basically saying I can never find meaning if I don't agree to a life of poverty. That's simply not true. We see many, many people who, they might not be, the wealthiest of their graduate. If they go back for a reunion of their college or something, or the university, they might not be the wealthiest of their classmates, but they've done just fine. They were able to support their family. They were able to send their own kids to school while still finding meaning and purpose in their work. But what that meaning is and finding that purpose is so individual and is so specific that it does require a lot of self-reflection and a lot of asking yourself really hard questions about where you're finding that and where you're not. And where you're not, course correcting as quickly as possible. When I talked earlier about falling on the path of least resistance, and this was a big theme in my doctoral dissertation, is, people who start on that thing that seems somewhat lucrative and they never stop to ask themselves those questions. They're the ones who have the midlife crisis because they're getting, 15, 20 years into their career. They're now making they're making enough money that they feel like it's going to be difficult to course correct, but they also have no idea what they want to do because they've never really asked themselves the hard questions. If you're always asking yourselves the hard questions, it is perfectly possible to make money and do well and serve your community and find purpose all at the same time.
Okay, I'm not a journalist. I'm a teacher. I don't want to tie anyone into knots, but I feel that personal course correction and institutional course correction. I mean, this is an area of research. I mean, this is not something in which I'm opining, but I'm just talking from my own experience. There are educational institutions that were set up in my country and in Africa. That was set up because the economies were not very vibrant, and people knew that they could eat out of their education. And that is what prompted Nelson Mandela to say that nations that eat out of their education are positioning themselves for disaster. So, I mean, I've been in education throughout my life. And I know people who were in transportation, who were in entertainment, who came into education, who became entrepreneurs because they were interested just in making money. That was their value. They did not have any initial commitment to community. The commitment was only to making money. And then they hire people to work for them who have a genuine interest in making a difference by educating people. Is that what should I call it? Is that difference in values the reason for the toxic work environments that we are seeing in the world? And a lot of people from all over the world complain about toxic work environments. Why do they happen? Is there a non-alignment of values between the employer and the employee?
Yeah, I mean, the topic of toxic work environments is an interesting one, and does tend to go along with how senior leadership is viewing their human capital. So this has become a common term, right? Human capital. And even if you unpack that term, it gets uncomfortable pretty quickly, right? Like, are humans human beings, or are they capital? Why do you have workers? Why do you need workers? How many workers do you need? And how should they be treated? How important is it to retain them? And how difficult is it to retain them? So in different markets around the world, it's going to be easier or harder to be attracting workers, in particular skilled workers, to do different roles. Where you end up with toxic work environments, which can play out virtually anywhere, is that when there is a real disconnect between why the workers are there and what they're trying to accomplish and how they're being viewed by the management and senior leadership as playing a role in the organization's success, not just as capital, but as human beings. And this is a very difficult thing to parse if you are the worker who hasn't started in that organization yet. Because some organizations do a very good job of selling themselves on a great place to work when they're actually not great. What can also be difficult is you might have an organization that on aggregate is a fantastic place to work, but you might get saddled with a bad manager. There's a very common adage where people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And that can happen in a really small part of a really big organization. Even if the really big organization is doing a lot of things right, that doesn't mean every single manager is. So when I'm working with students, it really comes down to really asking a lot of hard questions during the interviews. Like, they're not just interviewing you, you're interviewing them to get a sense of what this environment is like, and also trying to have the opportunity to talk to people who would be your peers or who recently left the job that you might be taking and get a sense of how do other people that might be kind of in your same age and stage and career level view that organization.
All right. I have 1 minute, so I will just put the last question of the day. What do you consider to be your greatest achievement? Something you can look back at and say, I did that.
So I'm going to give you an answer that I don't think you're anticipating. There's a lot of things. Anyone can look me up on LinkedIn, and there's going to be all kinds of things there that seem impressive. I have a fairly popular TEDx talk, and then I teach, and I'm at a major university, and I have prestigious degrees, and I've done all this stuff. If I were to point to, like, in life, the single thing I'm most proud of, it's my husband. I didn't meet my husband until I was 35. And had almost given up on the idea of having a traditional family. And we found each other. I sort of laugh at the last minute. I had my daughter when I was 38. But I think that, and we've now had a very successful, we've been together 17 years, and are still, very, very much in love, connected. And I think that if I were to point to something that I consider a huge achievement, it would be that. But in the context of the fact that we also find a lot of meaning in our work and education. And, if you're not happy in one area of your life, you can spill over into others. So being able to sort of bring that contentment to all areas of your life and be able to bring that together, I think is a huge achievement that most people at the end of the day strive for.
Please do show this recording and the answer to my question to your husband. He will be really, really happy to listen to your answer. And may God shower you with all the felicities of a happy and contented life. Thank you very much indeed. It was great having you. It was an absolute privilege.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you. Take care. Have a very nice day. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.